A man and a woman, nondescript, walk into a darkened bar. These two are unofficial representatives of the Sanders campaign, and she only goes by Sloan. There's a gentleman at the furthest corner, darkened by the light that swings over a table, wearing a fedora. These two people sheepishly are there, again, in an unofficial capacity, because they recognize that there were problems within the context of the campaign. They recognize three things. And it's not just them, they're there representing an element of the campaign that also came to this particular conclusion. Lefties tend to lose. Part of the reason lefties tend to lose is because they have a certain code of ethics in the way that they go about their campaigns, meaning Ned Stark's got his head chopped off. Their objective in this, earnestly, on the second point, is the belief that their candidate really does earnestly and authentically push forth a policy agenda that is global significance and domestic significance, not to mention cutting down on these notion of tensions around the world. And that they also, on the third point, believe that they had a responsibility, philosophically to some degree, from the people who are sending them cash in order to do everything that they possibly could to get their candidate elected, even if that went beyond the candidate's knowledge of such. In their heads, there's certain things that their candidate can't do. And part of the reason that they love the guy is that the guy can't do them. However, this brainchild, this organization of people, organically grown, decided that there are things that we need to do outside of our candidate's eye shot to ensure that he gets elected. And so Sloan is here to talk to the man at the end of the bar. They sit down. The guy, dignified, with the fedora, drops a photo on the table so gently as if it was never moved at all, opens to the first page, and it is a picture of Joe Biden, Operation Tower of Babel. The plan to end Joe Biden's campaign. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. This content is demonetized, is brought to you by you. So we like to say even a dollar helps. Joe Biden is not made of Teflon. It seems that way, but he's not. When I often talk about our election and how it's going in regards to the way of polling and that type of thing, I often try to stress that what's more important are trends, not necessarily the individual numbers. The individual numbers may vary according to the polling methodology and everything else, but the trends themselves do bespeak of truth. For example, this is Morning Consult. Biden, 31%. Sanders, 22%. Early primary states, 29, 24. Warren, 15. The trend here is that Warren has utterly and entirely collapsed. You can see here, pink line drops. Sanders goes up and becomes level as a 1-to-1 with Biden, meaning 1 and 2. Fox News poll, Biden, 30%. Sanders, 20%. Again, trend, Warren drops. What is that, 8 points in this poll? Sanders pops up 2. Another one, Emerson. Biden is right here. Biden, 32%. Sanders, 25%. Warren, 12%. Warren has dropped 8 in the Emerson poll. These are different polls, but I'm drilling home a point. Harris poll, Biden, 29%. Sanders and Warren, 13%. This is an outlier, but fair enough. It's a poll nonetheless. YouGov, Biden, 29%, up from 3. Sanders, 19%, up 3. Warren, down 4 at 17%. The trend is pretty straightforward and clear. Warren is plummeting. Sanders, surging. Biden is floating, even though he's floating downward. And just to make it clear, even if you look at the average of polls, right here, same thing. This is Warren, and notice, bam, collapse. Look at Sanders, surge, uptick. Joe Biden with a modest fall, even though this is where he was, but this is where he is now. So he is coming down. He's not the quote-unquote inevitable candidate. But one of the things that you need to notice, though, are the trends. What allows the people to be where those people are? In Sanders' case, he has a younger demographic to the point where he is getting like over 50% of the youth vote by himself. This crosses all demographics. He's strong with the Hispanic vote. Get him in spades. Joe Biden has been extremely strong with the African-American vote. Older African-American vote, but African-American vote. Same thing is true with the elderly vote. He's been able to pin down those demographics. Part of the reason that Warren is collapsing, yes, it's the Medicare for All thing. It's the disingenuousness with the Medicare for All thing. But the closer these guys get to the polling and the more it seems across as it looks as if it's a two-person race, then the virtue of it looking that way, to some degree, even almost makes it that way. It's almost a perception becoming a reality thing. Ultimately, what you end up with is that people who might have backed Warren saw her being dodgy with the Medicare for All stuff, and then it creates doubt on the other issues, and they come back home to Sanders. Now, they come back home to Sanders. So she has a hard time getting a placement or any particular footing when these two, for the most part, have been gobbling up major shares of the electorate. Buttigieg is not a thing. He can't get the black vote. He can't get the Hispanic vote. So, again, I make the point, this is a two-person race. Lefties have a hard time believing that Joe Biden could cross that finish line. But I am here to tell you that with the trend line, he is still floating and remaining, despite looking extremely weak as a frontrunner. Meaning, Joe Biden is not Teflon. He can be beat. Many of the attacks that have been levied against him, for the most part, have fallen flat. But those attacks were, for the most part, just flat. It wasn't a strategic, concerted effort in order to undermine, subvert, and to take down the main base of his support. Meaning, you don't hit him at the edges. You hit him at his mass. And the mass of Joe Biden's support, again, going along with the trends, African Americans, people who are elderly, but also on this notion of electability. All of these things should be rapidly, viciously, and a berserker raged attack, especially going into Iowa, in order to make those things very clear and to exploit those as weaknesses. Because even though people are considering these strengths of Joe Biden, the fact that it's a strength also makes it a weakness, especially when you have polling where people are this close to you. I mean, if you go into the state polls, you get a situation where Sanders is taking California or winning California. Sanders is winning New Hampshire. Iowa is a toss-up, but Sanders is 1 and 2 within the context of that toss-up. Meaning, in those very first few states, with the exception of South Carolina, Sanders could take all of those, whether he does or not. I'm saying the potential is there, considering where he is, to take all of those. In which case, what happens within the standpoint of South Carolina and some of those southern states? Biden is beatable. That's my point. But up to this point, Biden has not been tested, at least not in a real way. My argument is to test him in a real way, hit him and his mass. Some of the attacks cannot be attached to your campaign. Some of the attacks should be attached to your campaign. And from a strategic standpoint of a siege attempt at cutting into Joe Biden's numbers, if your goal is to win, and you believe you are a better steward of this country than all of the abilities, capabilities to your that you can muster, should be used to that task. Especially if you think this is an FDR once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The people from the camp are intrigued, and they listen. First 3 points. Attack him in his mass. Blacks, elderly, electability. Start one by one. Joe Biden gets on stage and says this. And just keep in mind, there are a few points here. Joe Biden is the guy that pushed forth the crime bill that got all of those African Americans arrested and locked up. And he full well understood the repercussions of that crime bill and was proud of his exploits. Listen to this.
Just went through this whole mandate debate saying they have got to keep every prisoner in jail like we do federally 85% of the time for which they're sentenced. Right now, they're only kept in jail in the states on average 41% of the time. I like the idea they keep in jail longer. I'm the guy that wrote the bill requiring federal judges to keep people in jail 100% of the time for which they're sentenced, and the notable exceptions only 80%.
If you're going to make a video and if you're going to attack Biden, my point is this is policy. And there's nothing wrong with hitting him on something like this, which again is entirely an issue of policy. But this is a policy that greatly disadvantaged a particular community, especially with this conversation between crack and cocaine and the sentencing disparages between those two. Biden knew about that. Biden was proud of that crime bill for the entirety of his political career and worked with racists like Strom Thurmond, essentially to put black people in prison for longer sentences. Your edge in the cut of that video can't just be crime bill. It has to be cut in a way to make it very clear that this was a policy that greatly disaffected African Americans, and Biden knew about it. And cross that with having a son that was a crackhead that for the most part was able to get a job elsewhere, meaning Joe Biden's son got a privilege that he didn't afford all of these other people who were put in prison for longer sentences, that he himself was out there championing. That video needs to be cut in a way that goes towards a particular group, the very group that Joe Biden is hoarding. This answer right here. And by the way, the busing, same thing. It wasn't just that Joe Biden was against busing. He was against this notion of even the classes being together. So, damn it, I hate it when it does that. It reloaded. Right here. Political experts and education policy researchers say that Biden, in support of civil rights in other arenas, did not simply compromise with segregationists. He also led the charge on an issue that kept black students away from the classrooms of white students. His legislative work against school integration advanced a more palatable version of the separate but equal doctrine and undermined the nation's short-lived effort at educational quality, legislative and education history experts say. And the article goes on further to make the point that kids who were integrated had better outcomes, white and black. Meaning the white students didn't lose whatever edge or advantage that they had, but the black students, for the most part, did get better. Not to mention the whites, when polled, said that they had a better impression of issues pertaining to minorities. Biden gets on stage, says black folks can't raise their kids. Now, when my mom was having a conversation with, I forget who she was talking to, I think it was my aunt, she made the point that says, you realize he got on the stage and said blacks can't raise their kids. Oh, my niece, my cousin. And she says, what? He said, what? Her impression of him flipped on a dime. Why? Because you're coming out here saying that people can't raise their kids. Now, she would have never watched the debate. She would have never seen the news that goes forth. All of these attacks that Joe Biden don't know where he is. Joe Biden can't remember Obama's name. It doesn't land. That lands. That hits at an ideological issue. That hits at an issue of core person and what he thinks in his head and legislative record. Meaning all of the stuff needs to be used in order to leverage an attack on him to go at this very specific element of his base, be it the African American base.
Conversation about how to deal with segregation in schools back in 1975. You told a reporter, I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago. You said that some 40 years ago. But as you stand here tonight, what responsibility do you think?
By the way, did you hear the audience groan at that? The audience was like, ugh. This is a Democratic primary, after all. These guys are identitarians. And whatever they want to think of Joe Biden and everything else, on issues of social issues, meaning in the very specific sense of identity issues, this does bite for them. They hate the fact that Joe Biden got caught saying that. Let's keep going, because I want to get to Joe Biden's answer on this. Because his answer on this, Zerlina Maxwell, immediately after Joe Biden said this, was on MSNBC saying he has to drop out the race. That's viciously racist. This is literally the most racist thing I've ever heard any candidate, any person say.
That Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
Well, they have to deal with look, there is institutional segregation in this country. And from the time I got involved, I started dealing with that. Redlining, banks, making sure that we are in a position where, look, we talk about education. I propose that what we take is those very poor schools, the Title I schools, triple the amount of money we spend, from $15 to $45 billion a year. Give every single teacher a raise to the equal raise of getting out the $60,000 level. Number two, make sure that we bring in to help the teachers deal with the problems that come from home. The problems that come from home, we have one school psychologist for every 1,500 kids in America today. It's crazy. The teachers are, and I'm married to a teacher. My deceased wife is a teacher. They have every problem coming to them. We have to make sure that every single child does, in fact, have 3, 4, and 5-year-olds go to school, not daycare, school. We bring social workers into homes of parents to help them deal with how to raise their children. It's not that they don't want to help. They don't know quite what to do. Play the radio. Make sure the television,
And the answer supposedly aimed at the legacy of slavery. It was incoherent. But the incoherent part is not the part that bites into him. It's what he's saying. Meaning, this notion of how do you affect the legacy of slavery, he is entirely incoherent in the answer. He ends up saying that kids are hearing less words, okay, and bring social workers into the homes because they don't know how to raise their kids. That's the part. That's the part. That's the ding, ding, ding. That's the part that bites. People hear that. Whites, I'm sorry, didn't give this. Whites heard this and just kind of let that ride. African Americans on media heard this and flipped out. Why did they flip out? Because this man has just said blacks don't know how to raise their kids, and they need social workers to come to their homes to teach them how to do that. And this is in an answer on the legacy of slavery. Biden, again, has worked in order to keep segregation in place. And this is not to say that he's bad on everything in this area. Don't misunderstand me, but on this specific area, he is horrendous. And that should be used to hit him, especially since Sanders was out there marching with Martin Luther King, and there are the pictures to show it. And juxtapose Sanders talking about the same crime bill. Hit him in his mask. Not all of these attacks need to be associated with the Sanders campaign. That's the first point. Some of these videos can arise, and some of these videos can just so happen to hit public. Some of these videos may even be sent to black churches all across the United States in order to get certain elements of, you can say, maybe of the community to be more aware of this. I guess my point is, there are ways of dealing with this that don't necessarily have to go into this just one guy arguing against the other guy. Contests are not won in that particular way, even though it seems that Sanders believes that. But I suppose that's why you're sitting here now. That's why we're having this conversation. Electability and the elderly. Joe Biden, is Social Security really safe for Joe Biden? Now, under Obama, he was willing to cut Social Security. Well, that should be a red line in and of itself. Now, the older population may not necessarily be entirely engaged to what takes place on debates and everything else. And this notion of the elderly and electability are almost kind of hand in hand with one another, especially if you're talking about African Americans. This is not a policy debate, right? At this point, this has become one of those feeling debates. The electability argument needs to be attacked on this front. And the electability argument gets attacked on this notion of, can Joe Biden really hold up to what is about to take place in regard to the general election In 2016, most people would say Sanders could have won, or a lot of people, if they were being honest. Some people did say that in the media. A video playing that up is a really big deal. A strong focus, a strong intent behind the Sanders camp with a full thrust of energy into, we are the better people to win this race, not Biden. We are the better people to win this race, not Biden. To take up that mantle, to enact this electability argument. And in order to make that argument, to explain why. Now, the explanation of why, to some degree, is going to ding the other campaign. And you may need to go in corners that other people may not necessarily want to go. And again, all of these videos don't necessarily have to be attached to you, nor do all of these arguments need to be directly attached to your campaign. But they should be made and they should be pressed. If you have any qualms about this, you must understand primaries are meant to be competitive. And ultimately, if your candidate or the candidate that's chosen in that primary gets out and gets abused by Donald Trump, then the fact that the primary wasn't competitive would have been to the detriment of the entirety of the country, not just your particular party. Meaning this coddling of the candidates, or this coddling of Joe Biden. Do you think he's going to be coddled in the general? And any flaws and defects that are in place in the candidate from the standpoint of your campaign, but from the standpoint of even what you believe is in the best interest of this country, and not because you're pushed or motivated by something else, but authentically believe. And if you do so, then all the powers at your disposal must be mustered in order to take down Joe Biden. The electability argument needs to be torn asunder. Joe Biden not knowing where he is, that's where this kind of flows in. Joe Biden not being altogether there. Joe Biden not being able to give a cohesive argument. I make the point to you that Trump will be using this line of attack, and you should be using this line of attack also in the primaries. Again, it doesn't all need to have your name on it. But again, you guys are here in an unofficial capacity. So I will let you guys handle how you disseminate that information. Like, share, subscribe. Marcus Will, has Bernie called out Steyer on the debates? That's the problem. Bernie Sanders doesn't call out anybody, which is kind of my point. Sanders may hit let's say a Bloomberg, he may even hit a Biden. He's hands-offish with a Warren, but the hits on Biden and the hits on Bloomberg, these things are mild, especially in the hits on Biden. Biden is not your friend. Biden and you are running in a competitive political race, and your objective is to win. The reason why I even phrase this or talk about this in a sense of this kind of clandestine operations, because the net starkness that Sanders exudes, even though that authenticity is great for the people who support him, it is not great from the standpoint of trying to win a contest, especially when your political opponents don't have that particular standard or that ideology that constrains them. There has to be elements of his campaign that at the very least understand that Sanders can't go in certain corners, and that they themselves may have to take it upon themselves to take certain measures and steps in order to try to undermine other campaigns. And in this case, Biden. And I truly believe this because all campaigns act this way. Most campaigns, when they're going after, they do have opposition research. They do use opposition research to go after the campaigns. And they do try to find ways that are weaknesses within the context of the campaigns. Sanders does not need to take all black support away from Biden. He just needs to take a certain percentage points. And that's the same thing with electability. And I would argue that the electability argument is what the thrust of the support comes in. If you can undermine him even by a small amount on the electability argument, a lot of his support will drain away. That argument about Bernie could have won is a potent argument. The argument against what he was supporting from the standpoint of blacks is a potent argument. Joe Biden was arguing with Kamala Harris the states' rights. States' rights. I mean, that's a buzz, that goes off in people's heads, especially the older generation. Not to mention separate but equal, which was never true in the standpoint of his busing policy and the policy that he was pushing when he was in Congress, working with outright segregationists to do so. You gotta play that up. I know that feels kind of awkward, but the fact is that's true. That is his legacy. And him being with Obama for a couple of years doesn't necessarily wash that legacy away. Not to mention he's on the debate stage talking about blacks can't raise their kids. These are 3 points that need to be exploited and need to be hit. Especially the electability and the African American argument. I'll leave this here. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks so.